Women, life, liberty. Zan, Zandegi Azadi, welcome everyone to Feet to the Fire, holding Iran accountable for its egregious human rights violations. On behalf of the ABA International Law Section's International Criminal Law Committee, and with special credit to Regina Palosi, whose brainchild this program is, thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a highly informative and engaging event. Almost exactly 3 years ago, in November 2019, hundreds of thousands of Iranians throughout the country took to the streets to protest skyrocketing fuel prices. Despite the protesters' peaceful methods, hundreds were slaughtered by Iranian forces. The international community was largely silent in response to the barbaric events. So 3 NGOs established the Iran Atrocities Tribunal, known as the Aban Tribunal, to hold the Iranian regime accountable for the violence. The work of the Aban Tribunal was prescient, as the same regime is now in the midst of another bloody crackdown on the Iranian people, who have taken to the streets yet again. The country is presently consumed by a women-led uprising in the wake of the beating death of 22-year-old Gina Amini following her arrest by the morality police for violating Iran's compulsory hijab rules. For the Iranian people, the authorities' savage efforts to put down the protests today are a case of deja vu all over again, history repeating itself. In today's briefing, we will be hearing from some of the world's foremost authorities on international human rights and Iran. Among other things, our renowned experts will focus on the Aban Tribunal and its September 30th judgment, the ongoing protests that have consumed Iran, and what lies ahead for human rights in the country. The big question, of course, is could this be the beginning of the end for the Iranian regime? We're deeply honored to have welcome introductory remarks by ABA President Deborah Enix-Ross. Ms. Enix-Ross is a former chair of the ABA International Law Section, as well as a former chair of the ABA Center for Human Rights. So needless to say, our topic today has a great deal of resonance for her. Deborah?
Hello, I'm Deborah Enix-Ross, President of the American Bar Association. Thank you for attending this very important webinar about the troubling state of human rights in Iran. Human rights are an essential component of international law, the rule of law, and the values lawyers are sworn to uphold. As America's leading organization of lawyers, the ABA is committed to its leadership role to educate our members on these issues and advocate for justice. This webinar is a valuable part of the many ways the ABA helps unite lawyers to fight injustice and work for justice at home and abroad. The freedoms and liberties made possible by our system of laws and justice enable our independent profession to mobilize lawyers to defend threatened human rights advocates, protect vulnerable communities, and hold governments accountable under law. The ABA's International Law Section, Center for Human Rights, which I was privileged to chair, Rule of Law Initiative, and United Nations observers leverage the concern and expertise of members throughout our association. Our vibrant, member-driven organization could not serve as the voice of America's legal profession without you and your participation at programs like this. If you are an ABA member, I thank you for your support. If you are not an ABA member, I encourage you to visit ambar.org/join and consider joining us. And here's another request. On social media like LinkedIn and through your professional connections, please spread the word to your colleagues, especially to young lawyers and law students, the ones that you know, about experience with this webinar, what you have learned, and how your involvement in the ABA enhances your work and service. Let me thank the International Law section, my home section, the many program co-sponsors, our esteemed panelists, and everyone joining us for your continued outstanding work and dedication that makes our legal system strong and justice under the rule of law a reality for all.
Thank you very much, Deborah. As you will hear, our topic today could not be more timely. Today, November 4, the regime in Iran is celebrating the anniversary of the 1979 takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. As I alluded earlier, we're also within mere days of the third anniversary of the 2019 protests in Iran, which gave rise to the Aban Tribunal that we'll be talking about a little later. And today marks, by my count, I could be wrong, by my count, day 50 of the ongoing protests in Iran. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers, there are two quick housekeeping matters to cover. First, we've allowed ample time for Q&A after the speakers make their opening presentations. So as the speakers deliver their remarks, please type your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. Do not put your questions in the chat box because we won't see them. If your question is directed to a particular speaker, please indicate that fact too. Second, today's program is being videotaped and will be available for playback at a later time. So don't worry about scribbling a lot of notes. You can listen to it again later to capture what you don't capture today. I also want to take this occasion to remind all of the speakers that at the close of today's program, I'm going to be giving each of them an opportunity to leave us with a closing thought or closing remarks. So if you would just bear that in mind and give some thought now to what you want to say when we get there. Our first speaker is Mr. Javed Rahman, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. He served in that capacity since 2018. In addition, he's a professor of international human rights law and Muslim constitutionalism at Brunel University in London. He's written extensively on international human rights law, Islamic law, and the constitutional practices of Muslim majority states. Mr. Special Rapporteur, as our first speaker, in addition to everything else that I know that you plan to say, if you would please brief us on what is going on the ground in Iran, and perhaps begin with the events that triggered the ongoing protests, and give us some facts and figures on the number dead, injured, and the extent, the arrests and the extent of the protests that are going on. And then also if you would, share some anecdotes or observations to sort of paint a picture, give us the human face to what is going on. And then I know, of course, you want to put it all in the context of impunity and the impunity for the actions of the regime. Mr. Special Rapporteur, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm greatly honored to be able to present to you some of my key observations in the brief time that I have. Earlier this year, I noted in my report to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and I said as follows: institutional impunity and the absence of a system for accountability for violations of human rights permeate the political and legal system of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The absence of accountability derives from various deficiencies within state structures, including negation of the principles of the rule of law and separation of powers. End of quotation. Institutional impunity and the absence of a system for accountability has clearly been evidenced in the most tragic and serious violations of human rights that took place in November 2019 and that we have already made reference to. The absence of accountability or even state acknowledgement for the multitude of violations that took place by state agents in all corners of Iran in November 2019 and subsequently is not merely a disregard for human lives, but also a disregard for the rule of law. It was therefore of immense value to see civil society's efforts, which culminated in the establishment and the successful conclusion of the Aban Tribunal. In its judgment, the tribunal's findings establishes inter alia at paragraph 62 of the judgment summary of 30th September 2022, and I quote here from paragraph 62. The findings include, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the Iranian government and the security forces designed and implemented a plan to commit crimes against humanity of murder, imprisonment, and forced disappearances, torture, and sexual violence in order to quell the protests and conceal the crimes committed. End of quotation. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, history is repeating itself as the current situation of human rights is once again an unfortunate reflection of the institutional impunity and absence of any accountability for violations of serious human rights. On September 16th, Gina Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman from the Kurdish minority, died in police custody 3 days after her arrest for allegedly failing to comply with Iran's strict rules on women's dress by wearing an improper hijab. As in all previous instances, including the November 2019 atrocities, the state officials are asserting no misconduct or wrongdoing. However, it is clear to me and should be clear to everyone all over the world that Gina Mahsa Amini was an unfortunate victim of state repression and brutality. Tragic as her killing was, Amina was not the first woman to face the brutality of the state police. Unfortunately, as witnessed in the case of Nika Shakarimi and other girls and women, she was not the last one. Colleagues, if you would allow me to say a few words about the prevailing violence against girls and women in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Women and girls in Iran have now for years and decades been brutalized by the violent application of the law of enforced hijab, with their self-respect and human dignity completely violated. Not only have they faced fines, imprisonments, but also face serious and draconian punishments for convictions on morality-based or national security charges. Apart from the law on enforced hijab, girls and women suffer from other forms of discrimination and violations of their human rights. Age of criminal responsibility based on the age of maturity applies to girls at 9 lunar years. In many legal proceedings, a woman's testimony is half of the evidentiary value of that of a man, and the law exonerates violence against women and girls in a variety of ways. Women continue to face substantial discrimination in family laws, including marriage, divorce, custody, and guardianship laws. Women also face considerable legally sanctioned discrimination in political and judicial positions in employment, sports, and culture. The death of Gina Mahsa Amini led to waves of protests across the country and from all segments of society. Women and youth led the charge as they chanted, and as we've just heard, women, life, and freedom. The initial wave of protests has developed into nationwide protests, incorporating the widespread resentment generated over serious violations of human rights, including the violations and killings during November 2019, and other historic and contemporary injustices, all galvanizing in these recent protests. In an unfortunate yet predictable fashion, and as witnessed during the November 2019 protests as well, the authorities have responded to these protests by brutal repression of peaceful demonstrators and a shutdown of internet connections in a determined effort to stifling free expression and association of the Iranian population. More than 6 weeks since the wave of protests started, the unabated violent response by security forces, including by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the paramilitary besieged forces, have led to the reported death of at least 277 persons. In the province of Sistan and Balochistan alone, reports indicate that at least 66 persons, including children, were killed after Friday prayers on 30th of September. If confirmed, this would be the highest number of deaths from a single incident in the current protests. In the Kurdistan region of Iran, where, as I mentioned, Gina Amini came from, dozens of people have been killed. It is reported that at least 40 children, some of them as young as 11, have been killed by live ammunition, metal pellets at close range, while some have been beaten to death. As reported recently by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, despite grieving for the loss of a child, many families were pressured to absolve security forces by declaring that their children had committed suicide and making false confessions. Colleagues, over the past 6 weeks, thousands of men, women, and children have been arrested, which includes human rights defenders, students, lawyers, journalists, and civil society activists. In another most disturbing development, Iranian authorities have announced earlier this week that they will hold public trials for over 1,000 arrested persons in Tehran, the capital, and a similar number outside of the capital. The charges against these persons would include charges of corruption on earth and waging war against God that carry the death penalty. Now, the key point and the message that I want to give to you is that there has been a complete absence of accountability for gross violations of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. In my recent presentation before the United Nations General Assembly last week and to the UN Security Council on Wednesday of this week, I have once again stressed the significance of the role and responsibility of the international community in addressing impunity for human rights violations in Iran. In the light of the ongoing extremely serious violations of human rights in Iran, I have once again called for the prompt establishment of an independent investigative mechanism to investigate all human rights violations leading up to and since the death of Gina Mahsa Amini. I would conclude here, and I would be happy to take any questions and answer those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Special Rapporteur. A terrific overview in a very compressed time frame that we gave you. So we're very grateful for that. Again, I remind everyone to please type your questions into the Q&A box. Don't use the chat box, type them into the Q&A box. Our next speaker is Ms. Reem Al-Salam, who is joining us from Jordan. She's the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, its causes and consequences. She has served in that capacity since August 2021. She holds a master's in international relations from the American University in Cairo and a master's in human rights law from Oxford University. In addition to her distinguished post with the United Nations, Ms. Aslam is an independent consultant on gender issues and the rights of refugees and migrants, as well as transitional justice and human rights response. The floor is yours, Madam Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the invitation to be part of this event. I think Joeid has covered a lot of grounds already, so I'll try to fill in some of the blanks and perhaps elaborate on some other issues. Prior to doing that, I really would like just as a rapporteur in my personal capacity, really express my solidarity with the women and girls in Iran and those who support them, but also with women and girls around the world that are demanding equality and freedom from discrimination. And actually, in the next few minutes, I would like to also cover how what is happening in Iran cannot be delinked from what is happening worldwide in terms of pushback against gender equality and against the rights of women and girls. and how that pushback is becoming more vicious, actually, and more prominent, but also the pushback against the pushback by women and girls everywhere, civil society, and also those feminist men and those who support them is becoming more prominent. And I think perhaps to start off to say is that what really strikes one with what's happening in Iran is, of course, it started off as being women-led, continues very much to be the case, but in fact was very quickly also joined by the other half of society, by men and boys. And that's why it has also become as let's say, as impactful as it is. And in many ways, we should not be surprised that although the spark for this wider, let's say, protests was gender issues, it has now moved to be about broader issues beyond gender issues and to also include access to broader social and political rights. But that should actually not surprise us, because in many ways, women's rights in a country is really the thermometer or the barometer for how society is faring in terms of human rights, and also the level of prosperity and dignity in a society. And again, it's not surprising, because the 2030 agenda has also a sustainable development goal number 5, which makes it clear that if you want to achieve development, you have to also prevent violence against women, and you have to achieve gender equality. Now, the demonstrations started off because of the issuance of the hijab and chastity law, so in resistance of that law of August 22, which tightened really the regulations and tightened also the repercussions, if you were not to follow it, of how to put in the hijab or the extent to which you abide by the mandatory veil policy. However, it's not just about the hijab, and I think we have to be very clear about that. The hijab became a symbol of wider grievances about wider and more systematic discrimination that are at play here. And the proof for that, I would say, is that even women who continue to wear the veil voluntarily have gone out in the street to protest with women that didn't want to wear the hijab, and protest in support of the right to choose whether to wear it or not, but also to voice these grievances they have about the wider context in which they live. And as perhaps alluded to, what is very noticeable about what we're seeing today is, of course, that it's largely women-led, but also that many of the, let's say, victims of the violence inflicted are women, and also are adolescents and are younger children, prompting even the Committee on the Rights of the Child really to criticize Iran for the excessive use of force against children that are participating in peaceful demonstrations. The Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran mentioned a lot of the, of course, structural deficiencies when it comes to the rights of women. I'd like to say that until today, Iran is one of a handful of countries that has still not ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Oddly, also the US has not done so. And in addition to the points that Jawid has raised, I'd like to mention some other sort of glaring problems with the way women are treated in Iran. First, we should not forget that same-sex relations or relations between persons that are gender non-conforming are outlawed and punishable by death. And in fact, more recently, we have intervened on behalf of two LBT women that are also human rights defenders, because they had been convicted and sentenced to death by the Islamic Revolution Court of Oromiyah. Honor killings are still allowed. Marital rape is not criminalized. The civil code allows Iranian men who are recognized as the head of family to have a say on a woman's freedom of movement. And women can also lose their sort of the financial support if they do something in contravention of what their husbands say. And since sexual relations outside marriage are also criminalized, therefore Iranian women that may be victims of rape may feel less likely to come forward, because if they are not believed that this was rape, because then there is this sentence about having illicit sexual relations. Mitigating penalties for rape. If the victim forgives the rapist, should that rapist be a family member? If the father or paternal grandfather kills a woman, the sentence is reduced. And even on the sexual and reproductive health side, there's been a wide-ranging new law called Youthful Population Protection of the Family Law, which aims to boost fertility rates, and that severely restricts access to abortion, contraception, voluntary sterilization services, and related information, which of course then is in direct violation of women's human rights under international law. I should say that there was a draft bill to protect women on violence that was drawn up in 2019, and that has until now not been adopted, despite the fact, of course, that it has many problems with it. Now, in the interest of being comprehensive, and since I, as a rapporteur, also have an interest in looking at structural causes of let's say, problems when it comes to women's rights, and I have done that also with other countries. I just would like to also say, and it's not to justify in any way, of course, the human rights record of the country, but I think we have to admit also that the long-standing sanctions on the country have had a gender dimension and have had also a negative and destructive impact on vulnerable groups, including women and girls, especially female-headed households. And that was documented also by my colleague, the independent experts on unilateral coercive measures, who visited Iran in May. And she gives various examples of how millions of female-headed households and also women in low-income categories have, because of the sanctions, faced increasing difficulties in accessing basic services, including healthcare. Now, coming back also to the most recent issues, I think Jawid mentioned how we have expressed or alarm at the excessive disproportionate crackdown on protesters, and how the excessive use of force has affected predominantly also women and children, including, including girls and including very young girls, actually, and boys. And that there has been excessive and disproportionate penalties for demonstrators that have been arrested. And he's also spoken to the impunity for the violence that has been committed. Now, one perhaps last few issues I want to touch upon. Of course, the government of Iran and others, actually, not just Iran, do invoke their social, cultural, and political norms sort of as a reason to justify their non-abiding by international human rights norm. And I just want to say that if you look at other Muslim majority countries, other than Iran and Afghanistan, none of them have mandatory veiling policy. And even if they were to have them, I think international law is very clear that states cannot use their religious, political, or social systems in order to argue non-compliance on human rights. I think I already alluded to the fact of how what happens in Iran doesn't stay in Iran. I think it's part of this global sort of push to resist the pushback against women's rights and against gender equality, because in many parts of the world, actually in all parts of the world, we're seeing increased attempts to control what women say, what they think, what they do with their bodies. And women are angry, and they are getting increasingly flustered by this pushback and are resisting it in a fearless and courageous manner. And of course, women everywhere and their supporters are also watching how this will play out, and what this will lead to. So I want to say solidarity is very important here. We have to make sure that civil society, human rights defenders, feminist organizations, and all those actors that are peacefully calling for the rights, feel the solidarity worldwide. We have called for the establishment of human rights investigative mechanisms. We have asked the government of Iran to engage special procedures mechanisms, also the ones that they not be very interested in engaging with, like my colleague Jawid, not to pick and choose who they want to engage with and not. And I think also it's a very important opportunity for the Commission on the Status of Women actually to rise to the challenge and to actually do what also the resolution establishing the Commission on the Status of Women has mandated it to do, and which it could do more of, namely to address worrisome developments that have to do with the treatment of women and girls worldwide. This is one of, in Article 10, the Commission has actually the duty to do that, and I haven't seen much of that done, not just for Iran, but also other situations. So with that, I'll stop here and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Special Rapporteur. As you indicated, this is now, it's gone far, far, far beyond mandatory hijab rules. The goal now really, I think, is being framed as the fall of the Islamic Republic, the fall of the current regime. You also referred to the role that we're being played by women and youth in the protests. And there's an NGO, I can't remember which one, but it's relatively reliable given how little information we get out of Iran. I should say that differently. I'm actually surprised by how much we do get. But in any event, that as of the end of October, the average age of those who had been arrested, roughly 14,000 have been arrested. The average age is just 15 years old, and most of them are still in custody. So it's really quite a shocking situation. Our next speaker is Colleen Rohan, an international criminal law defense attorney. She's represented members of the military and private clients in complex cases involving charges of murder, terrorism, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In her domestic practice, she specialized in death penalty cases, gang-related cases, and international extradition and post-conviction remedies. She served as a judge for the International People's Tribunal on the Iran Atrocities of November 2019, the Aban Tribunal that you've heard much about, investigating charges of crimes against humanity committed by the Iranian authorities and security forces against civilians in connection with the 2019 protests in the country. The tribunal handed down its judgment in London just a little more than 1 month ago on September 30th, 2022. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. I will be talking primarily, needless to say, about the Aban Tribunal and the proceedings that occurred there. I wanted to give a little bit of background about the events that led up to the creation of that tribunal, which was essentially a very large protest that started in November of 2019 in Iran in response to a huge increase in gas prices, and the population was distressed and outraged by that. There were spontaneous demonstrations across the country. Thousands of people went into the street. And as we're seeing today, in response to the demonstrations that are going on today, the Iranian forces, security forces, with, as far as we can see, the blessing of the government, engaged in essentially a countrywide crackdown on what had been peaceful protests that went on for several days. And in the course of it, although the information that we received is by necessity not complete, anywhere from 400 to 1,500 people, protesters and others, were killed. And how were they killed? There were protests in the street. Protesters were surrounded by security forces who ultimately armed themselves with not only just police-level weapons, but military-grade weapons. There were snipers located on rooftops who then indiscriminately fired into the crowd of unarmed individuals. And again, 400 to 1,500 deaths, although based on some of the witness testimony we received during the Aban hearings, that number may have been even larger than that. There were over 7,000 arrests that have been documented. The manner in which people were detained and held after detention gave rise to concerns, and ultimately the findings of the Aban Tribunal that individuals had been tortured, subjected to sexual assault and rape. This included children. People died in custody. This included children. And by children, I mean individuals, at least based on the evidence available to us, who were 10 years old, 11 years old, 15 years old, children. What happened as a result of this was nothing, which is something that's been mentioned by other individuals here. And there was ultimately a public call by the Iranian community around the world, but also people around the world, looking for some kind of investigation into what happened and some attempt to find some level of truth and justice for the individuals who were victimized in the course of these protests. And as was also referred to earlier, within Iran itself, there had been, at least again, according to the evidence that we saw and the evidence available and the information available simply in the press, there had been absolutely no attempt made there to deal with the violence that occurred. There was no procedure for victims to receive any kind of reparation or any kind of justice. There was no process for holding anyone accountable. In the face of evidence of the significant commission of crime, as far as anyone knows, reviewing that history in that period of time, no one has ever been called to justice. And the Iranian government tends to take the position, and they are today, that these kinds of protests are somehow, they're the result of foreign interference. The United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, there's a list of governments that have been named by the Iranian government and also by people who are out simply to create problems within the country, and that the violence that occurred was a result of these foreign forces and these foreign individuals who were intent on pursuing that kind of violence. The problem with that position, again, based on the evidence we saw at Aban Tribunal, was that the violence went on for days and days, separate from the fact that individual witnesses identified members of the Iranian security forces as engaging in the violence, and in many instances actually identified individuals. Separate from that, there was no indication that had these individuals been in some way foreign inspired, that the Iranian government went in with any attempt to stop what was going on. The violence simply continued. And again, that led to ultimately the call, and there were members of the civil society who answered it, that a people's tribunal be established, since no government had responded to the situation, to look into what happened during that period of time in November of 2019. And I thought maybe I should make a couple of comments here about what a people's tribunal is, because not everyone is familiar with the concept. And it's an interesting one, and it's an empowering one for people around the world. The idea of a people's tribunal, was created by Bertrand Russell in the 1960s. And the very first people's tribunal was one that was in fact put together to address the commission of war crimes during the Vietnam War. So Mr. Russell, along with Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and a series of other individuals, not all of them lawyers, none of them judges, but certainly people who were concerned with what had been going on and the fact that there had been no response to it, put together a people's tribunal. And there have been a number of tribunals since then, which follow various formats, some more legalistic than others. And I'm going to describe for you in a minute what we did with the Aban Tribunal. But to give a sense of this, the tribunals have been put together to look at what occurred in the Iraq War, to look at what occurred in Afghanistan, to look at women's rights, to look at what has gone on in China with the Uyghurs, a series of subjects. There have been, I think, in the area of 100 people's tribunals since the idea was first created in the 60s. And it's interesting to me that we hear not enough about this, and perhaps in our age of information, we'll start to hear more. Because even as a lawyer, I was unaware of the concept of people's tribunals until fairly recently. And it is a very, very interesting way in which the individuals in a country can address issues going on in their country in an organized way that creates a record and can become useful for the people who have the ultimate authority and legal authority to address some of these issues. So for example, a people tribunal does not have the legal authority to charge someone with a crime. They don't have the legal authority to seek a subpoena as an established entity would. But they do have significant moral authority and historical significance. The People's Tribunal can, by virtue of receiving the evidence from witnesses, create, number one, and I think this is among the most important functions, an historical record of what went on. When no one else is there investigating, listening to people, looking at what happened, the People's Tribunal can put together that historical record. It is then there for use by anyone in the future when and hopefully actual legal proceedings can take place. It also, by virtue of the fact that People's Tribunals hold public proceedings, the proceedings are transparent. They are available for people to watch now on the internet, for example. The hope is to build public awareness of issues. And for example, I didn't know as much about what was going on in Iran in November of 2019, that's for sure, until I was asked to participate in the Aban Tribunal. And then, of course, a wealth of information was produced. That information is now available to people who want to see and want to know what went on during that period of time. And hopefully that will be of huge importance because there is clearly a direct connection between the events of that time and what's going on today. In fact, I watch it, see, the same security forces are involved, the same procedures are involved, the same descriptions are being provided by the Iranian government as to what is going on and why. The parallels and the connections are absolutely clear. The other is that it provides a place for victims and witnesses who went through these extraordinary events to discuss them and talk about them and have their voices heard. And one of the things we saw during the proceedings of the Aban Tribunal, people came to watch the proceedings holding up pictures of their loved ones who had been murdered or who had been disappeared or who had been abused or otherwise were victims of the proceedings. People who came to testify spoke in terms of, I am here on behalf of my cousin. I am here on behalf of my brother. It was a very, very important proceeding for individuals who appeared. The other was that, and I'll get into the actual proceedings that we used in a minute, which will make this a bit clearer, but there are many people, most people who came to be witnesses were fearful for their lives for testifying, fearful for the safety of their family for testifying. They appeared with faces, behind masks and other forms of coverings. But it was extremely important for these people, nonetheless, to take this risk, even though this was a tribunal that would not necessarily result ultimately in a legal proceeding, although we hope it does. They came nonetheless. And that, I think, shows the importance of making these kinds of proceedings available in these kinds of situations. The other is that although the People's Tribunal, it's not a replacement for an official body, it can be of tremendous assistance to an official body. So, for example, the Aban Tribunal, we are hoping will be a precursor to the establishment of some intervention by the UN, by the International Criminal Court, by whatever body that looks into what goes on in Iran. We are a precursor for them. We have a record for them that's been well developed that can be given to them. A People's Tribunal can also complement an existing body. And I learned very recently that there were People's Tribunals that were addressing the situation in the former Yugoslavia and had put together those records that were made available to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Now, I had cases at that tribunal, but I didn't serve on a bench there. I wasn't a prosecutor there, so I don't know to what extent that information was actually used, but it was definitely available there. And I think that's extremely important, and it underlines the significance that a People's Tribunal can have. And also, finally, it can, by virtue of its public positioning, put pressure on governments to do something. And again, we're hoping that will be the result of the proceedings at Aban. Those proceedings, by the way, various people's tribunals conduct themselves in different ways. Some are more reminiscent, for example, of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Some follow the more traditional legal structure, and that is definitely what we did with the Aban Tribunal. We followed as closely as we could the kinds of proceedings that you would see in an international court or an international tribunal. So, for example, we created a statute that provided the mandate for the tribunal, what we were looking into and why. We created rules of procedure and evidence that closely followed the kinds of rules and procedure and evidence that are functioning now at the International Criminal Court. And then we abided by them as closely as we could. We used evidentiary rules to determine what evidence was reliable and credible, what evidence was relevant. And the proceedings themselves were conducted in the sense that a trial might be, albeit we were in a large, open, public room. And witnesses came, some in person, to testify there. The vast majority were testifying by remote. They were on Zoom. And as I said, they were fearful for their lives. They had their identities covered. And some, in fact, had to leave partway through their testimony for fear that they would be discovered. So it was close to the process that you would find in a normal international criminal trial where witnesses are provided protection, and we tried to abide by that. We then reached a judgment, which has been mentioned. A summary judgment was presented in London on September 30th, and that judgment arose from hearings we held, in-person hearings in London in November of 2021, and then in February we held remote hearings because of the pandemic and other issues in February of 2022. During that proceeding, we had 55 witnesses who testified in the proceedings themselves. We had approximately 170 written witness statements. And one of the things that happened was when the whole thing started out in November, the plan was there would be hearings in November, and that would probably be it. People in Iran were watching, and Iranian people around the world were watching, and there was an outpouring of individuals who contacted the Aban Tribunal after that saying, please, do you have time for me to testify? Can I submit a witness statement? We received so many of those that we had to hold, and we're happy to hold, the additional hearings in February 2022. We then issued the judgment. The judgment that came out on September 30th is a summary judgment. There is a complete judgment which is finished now. And I looked today on the website for the Aban Tribunal. I didn't see that judgment was up as yet. It's available in English. It is being translated into Farsi. And it may be that it's not on the website because it's not yet translated. I don't know. But I'm for certain it will be up very, very soon so that everyone can read the complete judgment, which goes very, very carefully through the evidence, or hopefully it does, and comes to the conclusions that we reached. I know my time is limited, so I'm rushing slightly. But the conclusions essentially were that we found that beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard, the evidentiary standard that we used, that crimes against humanity existed and were committed during the November 2019 protests. And those crimes included murder, torture, sexual assault and rape, unlawful arrest, and enforced disappearance. By a majority, the panel found that the crackdown of the government also constituted a form of persecution. So those were the findings we made beyond a reasonable doubt. We then looked to individuals who had been named as potentially accountable, liable for these crimes. And one issue that happened with the Aban Tribunal, although we repeatedly asked the government of Iran to participate, they did not answer those requests. They did not participate. So we did not have anything other than one side of the situation. Let's put it that way. We had no response to the government of Iran. We wanted to be very, very careful about protecting the rights of anyone who was named by anyone throughout the period of the hearings. And so we found, as to 14 out of many more individuals who had been named, as to 14 of them, that there was a case to answer. And those of you who are lawyers will understand, but those of you who are not lawyers, this simply means there was evidence enough there that we believe you should explain yourself. You have a case to answer here. And those names are listed in the judgment, which people can read. They're listed also in the summary judgment, which is on the Aban Tribunal website. And what we've called for among recommendations that the Aban panel came to is that there will be, either by the Iranian government within the Iranian domestic legal process or by international, a proper trial of these individuals after a proper and continuing investigation of what went on, so that there can be a determination as to who is accountable, and if so, accountable for what. And the recommendations that we made, ultimately, certainly we called upon the government of Iran to conduct the proceedings. We also asked the government of Iran to release the individuals who are still in detention, many of them held arbitrarily. And again, there's been no response. But we've also asked the international community to intervene, both the UN in seeking the intervention of the UN and also the International Criminal Court. I have a feeling I've run out of time. And I know that we'll be answering questions, which I'm happy to do. I would, though, however, anyone who is interested in the process that we followed and also the specifics, the actual hearings that we held are on the website of the Aban Tribunal. And if you just type in Aban Tribunal in a search, you will find it. And I encourage you to watch them. And thank you.
It's a terrific website. I'm glad that you have referred people to it. It's really easy to find, and there's just a wealth of information there. I'm looking forward to the full judgment being posted, but there's a 20-plus page summary of the judgment that is available now that is very, very informative. So thank you for that. I appreciate you reminding people about questions. So everyone, please go to the Q&A box and type your questions in there. And I would be remiss if I failed to note that Regina Palos, who conceived this program, served as counsel, one of two counsel to the Aban Tribunal. We're, again, very, very grateful to her for giving birth to today's program. Our next speaker, our final speaker of the day, is Gisu Nia. She's a human rights lawyer and the director of Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. The Strategic Litigation Project works on prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses around the world. She also chairs the board of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, where she is helping to develop and oversee the group's human rights advocacy and legal programs, which seek to promote accountability and respect for human rights and the rule of law in Iran. Her publications include Closing the Accountability Gap on Human Rights Violators in the Islamic Republic of Iran through Global Civil Litigation Strategies. I know we already have some questions on the subject of the use of litigation, so we're very anxious to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Really honored to be here. Just going to note that I have a very terrible cold. So if I cough here and there, that's why. Do not be alarmed. So great to be here. And I think the speakers that came before me really covered a pretty wide range of the nature of violations that the Islamic Republic of Iran commits in terms of human rights violations and atrocity crimes, and also the impunity gaps. So I'm going to quickly address a few paths forward and what are the approaches that a lot of us at civil society organizations and those who've been working on human rights issues in Iran and trying to seek accountability have been pushing really since the disputed presidential election of June 2009. So there was a disputed presidential election in the country. there was extreme state violence on peaceful protesters, and that was the entry point for a lot of people who were looking at accountability in forums outside the country. Because I think for a long time, there was a discussion about how the Islamic Republic of Iran needs to properly investigate, needs to pursue this through domestic channels. And it's become, I'd say, crystal clear that they're unwilling or unable to do so. And that's really why we're looking to international courts, forums, bodies, or national courts that have universal jurisdiction principles in place, or who have other kinds of legal frameworks that have extraterritorial application to really lead that forward. So I'll try to keep it brief, noting time and that we want to have questions. First of all, the thing that, for anybody who's listening here and who wants to know how they can help as well, the lawyers who are on this call, or those who want to engage with their elected representatives or encourage UN member states to do certain things, I'll just touch on the need for a UN investigative mechanism. We already heard from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran that this is a need, and want to dive a bit onto why it is. So we've had this call in place since November 2019, since the events of Aban protests, which obviously Colleen Rohan was talking about with us. This call has been in place, but there wasn't sufficient momentum behind it to get it established. And one reason was that at the time that a coalition of 30 plus civil society organizations were asking for it, there were also protests in other countries around the world. And then COVID swiftly followed after that. So a lot of these debates in multilateral institutions really came to a close and a slowdown. It didn't really have to do with the merits of why we needed one. It just had to do with the circumstances at the time. The energy around that has now been renewed. And the reason why it is absolutely critical that we get a UN investigative mechanism set up on Iran is because there are reports that mid to lower level perpetrators are leaving the country right now, or are readying plans to leave the country. Now, we can't verify all of that just yet, but if that's the case, and if these folks end up in different European countries, as they have in the past, and their children live, work, and study in these countries, and they may have multi-year visas, if they end up in any country that has a universal jurisdiction type framework, then there is always the possibility that there could be an arrest warrant, or there could be an indictment for the crimes that they've committed back at home against Iranians. We had the first ever universal jurisdiction trial that happened over the past few years, with the Swedish district court issuing a judgment and convicting a former representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for crimes that were committed in 1988. So this was a historical crime, but that was the first ever trial for core international crimes against a representative of the Islamic Republic that happened in Sweden. And he was convicted in July. So this, these manner of proceedings are now gaining steam. There have been attempts to start structural investigations, so to encourage European prosecutors to start structural investigations, which, for those who don't know, means that there does not need to be a named perpetrator when the investigation is started. We have those types of structural investigations open on Syria, open on Ukraine, open to look into ISIS crimes. And I think there are strong grounds to encourage prosecutors in Germany, Sweden, and possibly France, if they tweak their double criminality bar there, to open these structural investigations. Up until now, we have not been successful. But I think that given changed circumstances, given the fact that some of these alleged perpetrators may actually end up in these jurisdictions, there really should be an emphasis on that with war crimes units in Europe. Now, this brings me back to the need for the mechanism. At the moment, we have a range of civil society organizations that engage in documentation of violations. in the country. We also, not in the country because they can't be based in the country, but they're documenting those violations that are occurring inside the country. There are also citizen journalist collectives that are collecting a lot of documentation and play a really critical role in getting videos that are taken inside the country out to a global public. There are also the roles of people's tribunals, as Colleen Rohan was mentioning. There was a people tribunal back in 2012 called Iran Tribunal that was set up to look at the killings of thousands of political prisoners in Iran in the 80s. I was on the prosecution team for that People's Tribunal, and the findings of that tribunal were actually cited in the conviction of Hamid Nouri that I had just mentioned that was handed down by Swedish district court. So these People's Tribunals not only help with healing, with people telling their stories, even if they're not legally binding, the information can actually be used at a later stage to either act as lead information, to collect evidence, or to even be cited in an actual judgment. So they play an incredibly important role, and really hats off to Aban Tribunal for what they've done. So we need this mechanism because at the moment, we actually have no international body that has a forensics team, that has a sort of rigorous open source investigations unit working on looking at what is happening inside the country. Instead, we have many civil society actors who are doing a great job, but some of those efforts are siloed. We don't necessarily benefit from a centralized repository that can really do that with the sort of rigor that we need. So the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran has been incredibly important, and probably one of the only sort of, with an international imprint bodies or roles that we have to really look to and cite to when we're putting together legal submissions and the like. But that office is designed to be a reporting mechanism and not necessarily something that's narrowly focused on accountability. An investigative mechanism would provide a very different and much more
Gisu, you've frozen on the screen, unfortunately. Are other speakers, is she frozen for you as well? Yes? Okay. Well, we can hope to regain you, and we'll give you some time to wrap up when we do. But in the meantime, while we figure out that technological problem, let's go ahead and go to questions. We have a number of questions. I have many questions myself, but we have a number of questions, and I want to be sure that we get to them. So the first question is, would the UN Security Council make a referral to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for investigation? If not, I assume with 43 to 44 years of human rights violations, there are complaints that are older than 6 months that the UN Security Council has failed to refer, giving prosecution at the ICC the ability to launch investigations on their own. Are any of the speakers able to comment to that?
Yes, if I may briefly comment. That's a very good question. The difficulty, as you know, with the United Nations Security Council is that there are permanent members, namely Russia and China, who would oppose any such move of making reference or referral of Iran to the international permanent international court, and that creates a real obstacle in the effective functioning of the International Criminal Court in this instance. So I'm not very optimistic as to how the International Criminal Court could obtain jurisdiction. There are some other ways, but there would be quite significant challenges in making referrals to the International Criminal Court as regards the serious violations of human rights taking place in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Thank you.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? We have Gisu back. I don't know if you know where we lost you, but I want to come back to you and give you an opportunity. We had started questions since we lost you. Would you like to go ahead and take a few minutes to wrap up?
Well, we can blame hotel Wi-Fi. Hopefully I don't get kicked out again. But I think what I'm hearing is that this is about the question on the ICC. So actually that was going to be part of my remarks. So I'll just wrap there. And, I think there's some questions about civil litigation, which I also deal with. So on the ICC, agreed that there's no great pathways for looking at crimes that occur in the territory of Iran. I'm co-counsel on 2 Article 15 communications to the the ICC Office of the Prosecutor that bring allegations against officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But one is for transboundary crimes that occurred in the Syrian conflict that were completed in the territory of Jordan. And also one concerning the shoot down of PS-752, a Ukrainian airliner that was shot down by the IRGC. That happened over the skies of Tehran, but because the aircraft is registered in the state of Ukraine, and because 12.2a of the Rome Statute allows for jurisdiction over crimes that occur on an aircraft registered in a particular state, and because we have an open investigation into the situation of Ukraine, that's a jurisdictional basis. So right now, we really don't have the ability to look at crimes that are committed in the territory of Iran because the UN Security Council referral is really not on the table, as we know, because of China and Russia. And I don't think that the Islamic Republic of Iran will voluntarily be giving a declaration of jurisdiction. So that's just on that. The bit on civil litigation, the only thing I was going to add was I saw some questions in the chat about this. I think there's a lot of different pathways for that. A lot of it focuses actually on a designation of the Islamic Republic of Iran as a terrorist state. So it's in a different framework. It's more in a state-to-state terrorism-focused framework under which you could potentially bring cases, definitely in the US, but also in Canada, where the IRI is listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. European jurisdictions do not have an exception to state immunity for terrorism, so that's not possible there. But one thing that I and others have been working on is really looking at legislation that would allow for not just the freezing of assets of human rights violators and those that are perpetrating atrocity crimes, but also the seizure of those assets and to transfer those from alleged perpetrators to victims to rehabilitate victims and survivors of their crimes. This has a lot of legal challenges. We've seen this in the space with Ukraine and Russia. And I think everybody probably remembers this very flashy seizing of oligarch yachts. There are personal property rights that obviously are at play here, and one has to be really cautious and careful. But for those who are squarely part of the state, there should be provisions whereby victims can get reparations from that. Canada is the first country that is that has introduced legislation that allows for this repurposing, and we're hoping that Iran could be a first test case, obviously with all the caveats around making sure that, the asset seizures are in line with due process and making sure that that's, all handled in the right way. But there are pretty active efforts looking into this, not only in the situation of Iran, but across country contexts where victims are badly in need, not only of truth and justice, but also reparations.
Anyone else?
Yes, if I could come in.
Please.
Perhaps on a related issue, since we're speaking about the International Criminal Court. I think this and other countries, I'm thinking also in particular Afghanistan, could consider, for these countries, we could consider looking also at gender-based persecution, which, as you know, is included in the Rome Statute as a crime against humanity that falls under the jurisdiction of the court. And of course, persecution is a severe deprivation of fundamental rights, contrary to international law. And in this case, it would be based on gender. And, while the definition of gender right now in the statute is restricted to two sexes, male and female, within the context of society, the court is actually revising its gender policy, and it's looking at gender persecution to also include discrimination against individuals or groups because they don't fit socially prescribed categories of femaleness and maleness. So just to say that, crimes against individuals that are gender non-conforming. And the reason I say this is because generally there hasn't really been enough jurisprudence on this crime as a crime against humanity. And it hasn't been enough sort of used by tribunals. There is a reference to it in some national penal codes, but I think that's definitely something that should be more investigated on intersectional grounds, and also possibly in this case.
Thank you. We have another question. Gisul, you referred to Syria. This question reads, you understandably cite the need for an international investigative mechanism. We've seen such mechanisms with Syria, for example, where the state has refused to allow the mechanism in. Likely Iran would do the same. What is the tangible impact of such an independent mechanism?
It's a great question. So when we're looking at the situation of investigations on Iran, it's a very different context than, let's say, Ukraine, where there are access to crime sites, where forensic investigators can actually visit the scenes of crimes and collect certain types of information and run certain types of analysis. But there's still a very, very strong benefit to having this kind of an investigative mechanism because of all the information that can be processed through the online space. So Iran is a very connected society in terms of Wi-Fi penetration. They were the second country in the region to adopt the internet. So they're an early adopter of the online space. And indeed, most of the information that civil society organizations and those that are doing this kind of documentation work obtain are really through the ability to communicate with our network inside the country, which mostly is done virtually. Either through chats or video and photo evidence that's sent to us, as well as documentary evidence that's sent to us. Now, obviously, with the Islamic Republic of Iran doing its utmost to disrupt internet and to cut different provinces, in particular those on the margins, off from the online space, that obviously complicates the collection of that. I can't really get into the details of what the solutions are, but needless to say, there have been some attempts to bring internet connectivity to different parts of the country, which is why you're still seeing so many videos of protests. So without getting into those details, which are a bit sensitive, there's ways around that. But an investigative mechanism would have the kind of OSINT capacity to really do the collection, preservation, and verification work that we so badly need, especially because at the moment, a lot of videos are being lost. They're not being properly preserved, collected, or if they are, it's not something that would necessarily be readily accessible to prosecutors in the future for any future accountability processes, or there could be some rookie mistakes made along the way that would not accurately collect the metadata or do something that would disrupt chain of custody. So we really need the investigative mechanism to ensure that the processes that are happening right now really set us up well for future accountability. And also that there's a burden of proof that can sustain a criminal indictment. So that's why I'm not really urging the establishment of a fact-finding mission or a commission of inquiry, unless a commission of inquiry did indeed have that burden of proof or really had strong accountability elements. I think it's best that it be an investigative mechanism. And I know that's the unified call of, more than 30 civil society organizations, as well as special rapporteurs and working groups that also issued a call last week urging the HRC to set one up.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay. Okay, our next.
Sorry, if I can just jump in.
Please.
And definitely very much agree with the previous speaker. I also want to say that the fact that an investigative mechanism may be denied entry does not necessarily mean that it will not be able to collect good information from victims that are outside the country. We already see this with other investigative mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, for example, the one for the occupied Palestinian territories, Burundi and Eritrea. And also the fact that these reports are released publicly and have also recommendations that look at root causes and that make also recommendations about structural reform to address the violations, I think is important. Is important to be there. It's important to be documented, and also can serve perhaps as a deterrent in the future that these things will be documented and can be used in the future. For criminal proceedings and for justice.
Mr. Special Rapporteur?
Yes, if I can add to what Reem and previous speakers have mentioned, I think an international investigative mechanism is now a necessity. I have been calling out for accountability for years since I took over the mandate, and we've seen 2009 and even going back as far as 1988. That there has been no accountability, there has been a complete impunity for all of these very serious violations of human rights. So that is the first key element, that we need an international investigative mechanism. The international investigative mechanism can take any form which the United Nations Human Rights Council so feels is necessary. But the essential function would be to have documentation, information gathering, collection of real evidence for trials to hold people accountable. And the third point, which Reem already has mentioned, is that the consent of the state, that is the consent of Iran, is not a prerequisite in terms of establishing such a mechanism. I'm pretty certain that Iran would vehemently oppose the establishment of such a mechanism because of the people who are likely and most probably would be held responsible or held accountable. But international law and international law of human rights and the international community so needs investigations at this point that we must set up an investigative mechanism. And the final point is that if we don't do anything now, we would be losing out on important evidence. There is no mechanism to retain all of this data. And therefore, it is important that we establish some kind of a mechanism for gathering information and documentation. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two questions for you, Dr. Raymond. The questioner says, many thanks for your insightful talk. I have two questions where I would appreciate further elaboration. First, how does the United Nations currently gather data on the human rights violations that have occurred and are continuing at the hands of the Islamic Republic during these protests, particularly with civil society's restricted access to the internet? And secondly, as it pertains to the special investigation unit you proposed, how could such an initiative result in genuine accountability measures for the Islamic Republic? And I am mindful of our time, but they're very good questions. So
yeah, no, these are very important questions. I think I have addressed, at least in part, the accountability bit, the significance of an international investigative mechanism and how it would operate. On the question of the United Nations data gathering and the information, if you look at the UN mechanisms, we currently have the United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur mandate, which I currently hold. So I produce two reports every year. One I submit to the Human Rights Council and the other one to the General Assembly, which I did last week. In terms of information gathering, I rely very heavily on civil society, but I also rely in engaging with the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the state authorities. So a lot of information actually does come from their own sources, that is the sources of the state itself. So in our conversation, even just today, we have made references to laws and to regulations which are state ordained. So a lot of the laws are there in the penal code of the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Penal Code. There are a lot of regulations. There are lots of state practices. So I rely on a lot of these in my reports. And just the final point that in addition to my reports, which are, as I said, presented twice in the year, the UN Secretary General also produces reports which are submitted to the Human Rights Council as well as to the General Assembly. So they are also a very important repository of valuable information for the international community and for the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, mindful of our time, there are two questions that are left. One is directed specifically at Ms. Rohan, and then there's a general question. I'm going to go ahead and read them both out. And Ms. Rohan, perhaps you can go first to answer the question that's specifically directed to you. And then anyone else can add and chime in. And I would appreciate it if someone could at least briefly answer the last question that we've received. Ms. Rohan, thank you kindly for your encouraging talk. How could foreign institutions and the international community ensure the safety of participating Iranian individuals if a People's Tribunal were to be organized? Could the People's Tribunal be established within another nation state by the Iranian people without pushback from the given foreign state? And then the final question, which is not directed to anyone in particular, if the country keeps denying access for accountability investigations in this regard, would it also fuel and expedite the international community, foreign powers, to push further and add this to the list of violations? Ms. Rohan, you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. You have asked an extremely important question, which came up in the course of the Aban Tribunal, because we did have the majority of witnesses who had very credible, very real threats to themselves or their families. And because we are not a legal entity in the sense of a court or a governmentally established entity, we could only go so far in providing protection for them. So your question is one that came up and bothered all of us quite a bit during the course of the hearings we held. Now, with Aban, the hearings were held in London. The government of the UK was fine doing that. And there may be governments around the world who are perfectly willing to have a people's tribunal take place within their borders. And I mean, that's about as far as I can go in answering the question, because the organization of a people's tribunal is simply the civil society people, whoever else have come together to put the tribunal together. That can be done easily anywhere. But the question really is, when you put it forward, where will it be? Will there be protection? In the case of the UK with the Aban Tribunal, that worked out all right. I have to say that there were protests from the Iranian embassy at the time with the government of the UK. They were resolved. Nothing became a major issue, and the hearings proceeded without incident. We did have some protection in the area where we were, but essentially it was fine. With the witnesses themselves, they were outside of the UK and were taking care of themselves in whatever capacity they had there. Mostly, the only thing we could recommend that they could do that was effective was hide your identity. And because there were translations being provided, you also could not, when the witnesses were testifying, for the most part, you could not hear their voice. You were hearing the voice of a translator, which is something that goes on in the international courts when there are protected witnesses, even sometimes without protected witnesses. So that's one way, and I think it really depends, obviously, on the government that you're dealing with. And the governments, at least in my limited experience, are open to this concept and process. The second question, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering all of it. It was about the accountability. I wrote down accountability.
The second question is, if the country keeps denying access for accountability investigations, would that fuel and expedite the international community, foreign powers, to push further and to add that denial to the list of violations?
Well, I don't know that a denial in that context, where a country is essentially asserting its sovereignty in the situation, would constitute a violation. I'd have to spend some time thinking about that. My initial reaction is no, that it would not. The other aspect, though, here is it's a practical problem. How do you get to information that you need in order to put an investigation together if you can't enter the country? And this is something that happens in the international criminal law world. I know of a team working at the ICC, for example, that was not permitted to enter Sudan to look for information. These things occur. One thing about the age of the internet is that there are many, many ways of circumventing this. And I'm not an expert who can provide a complete list, but people can send pictures, they can send videos, they can send statements, they can do all kinds of things that provide some information and some evidence without being physically present in the country. It's not as useful, it's not as beneficial as having access, obviously. But it's definitely a way to get information. That certainly happened with the Aban Tribunal. We definitely had no access, and we got a great deal of information.
The two special rapporteurs also have their hands up. I'm not sure whether it's from a prior question. Would you care to chime in on either of the questions that are pending?
Could I just briefly respond to the last question on access? Well, denial of access, in my case, I have been denied access since I took over this mandate. And in fact, none of my predecessors since 2011, when this mandate was renewed, have or were allowed access to the country. And that denial of access to my mandate constitutes a violation of the Human Rights Council's resolution. So in that sense, there is a breach of international law and what the Human Rights Council has set out the Islamic Republic of Iran to do. So that can be taken as a very serious, serious infraction or breach of Human Rights Council's resolution, which the Islamic Republic of Iran is currently engaging. And with the denial of access, I am denied a lot of information, reporting, and documentation of violations of human rights. I keep saying that I should be in the Islamic Republic of Iran at this time, and I should have been speaking to you from there to tell you firsthand what is happening. But unfortunately, Iran is not allowing me to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, sorry, can I just add to that?
Please. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, in fact, the Human Rights Council resolutions frequently refer to the issue of non-cooperation by states who refuse to systematically cooperate on visits or collaborate with any of the special procedures. So, as Jawid said, that applies to him. But what I also wanted to say, it becomes also an ask or a key advocacy issue that finds its way into other human rights mechanisms, like, for example, the Universal Periodic Review. In the last one that was conducted for Iran, I believe in 2019, there was a concrete recommendation that emanated asking Iran to cooperate with a special rapporteur.
Thank you very much. Our time has almost elapsed. We've had such a robust and really rich conversation, and yet I think it's apparent to all of us that we've barely scratched the surface. I promised that I was going to come back, though, and allow each of you an opportunity to leave us with one final thought, one brief final thought. And I would encourage you also to offer, anything concrete that you think that we should be doing as individuals, as lawyers, as the American Bar Association. And, that includes, should we be pressing the U.S. government to take action beyond what it's already taking? Mr. Special Rapporteur, we'll begin with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. So firstly, I wanted to thank all the participants and panel members. I think this has been one of the most useful sessions since the current crisis began. So I'm very grateful for the participation. If there is one message, I want to give it to you, and if you could engage directly with the US government and indeed with the international community, the message is as follows. In the light of the ongoing extremely serious violation of human rights in Iran, I once again call for the prompt establishment of an independent investigative mechanism to investigate all human rights violations leading up to and since the death of Gina Mahsa Amini since September of this year. So that is my message to you, and I would be grateful if you take it up to the international community and spread the word and spread this message forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Special Rapporteur, we will come to you next. And by the way, perhaps you could comment, I know very briefly, again, we're very short on time, but on the conversation that's going on about booting Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women.
Okay, so my ask would be to complement what Joeid said, is not to ignore the very strong gendered element to the situation in Iran, and therefore also for any proceedings looking at criminal responsibility, either at international courts or local courts, really to look at gender-based persecution and serious discrimination. On the CSW, as I said, this opportunity, and in fact, Afghanistan and other situations really offer the chance for the CSW to rise up to what's supposed to do, which is really to look very seriously at the situation, at the trends that are happening for women and girls and that are very concerning around the world, and really play a proactive role, going beyond lip service, but also going beyond sort of sticking to, let's say, safer topics or discussions that are already predetermined by capital cities and so on. Now, to be very frank, I do not think at this point, well, first of all, the CSW rules and procedures are silent about the issue of ejecting any member from it. So I have looked at that. I have not found anything that allows for that, since they are elected by the ECOSOC Council. At the same time, for the sake of consistency, may I just say that there's been members in the CSW, member states, representatives that have also very, very problematic records when it comes to women and girls and their protection. And I let you look at them, and you will see at least two of them, if not more. And third, I believe that we do need to still continue to do everything to engage the government of Iran. And to have these difficult conversations and to have the platforms and the spaces to do that.
Thank you very much for expanding on that point as well. Ms. Rohan, you are next, please. Your final thoughts?
Well, the first and very short one is that I join in encouraging the ABA to do what it can, what action it can take. The ABA is a powerful legal organization in the United States. And if there is a means for the ABA engaging the United States government in a meaningful way in this context, I very much endorse and encourage that. And the last thing I would say, and this is really directed to the people in Iran, to the extent that they'll ever know that we're uttering these words here today. One lesson I learned in the course of the many years I practiced doing war crimes cases in the international courts is that despite the horrors of war, despite the incivility and the instability and the violence that can occur in the world is filled with people who are searching for means of resolving these issues in ways that permit them to simply lead their lives. And, today the people of Iran are involved in the struggle, and they're in the streets. They're chanting women, life, and freedom. I would add to that peace and security. And that the people of Iran know the world is watching this and that they're not alone.
Thank you very much. And now we go to the walking wounded. Gisu.
Thank you. I didn't note during my remarks, because they were just very focused on accountability, that I was one of the organizers of the public letter that appeared in the New York Times centerfold that was signed by Michelle Obama, Malala, Nadia Murad, and women from more than 14 countries, with an Iranian women's collective as well, who has signed on to a letter demanding the immediate removal of the Islamic Republic from the Commission on the Status of Women. And that is because of what we heard from Iranian women in the country, who are absolutely appalled that the Islamic Republic of Iran is in a kind of leadership role on the CSW. They remember that they have been in these roles for a long time, that they were going to be on the newly formed UN Women back in 2010. And for them, they don't see any improvement. They don't see any real constructive engagement. And instead, they see side events that the Islamic Republic of Iran puts on, saying that the place of women is only in the domestic sphere and it is in the home. And that is part of how they try to shape the norms. So they're very incensed. And because this is a sort of feminist uprising, really, and a woman and girls driven spate of protests, they're pretty furious about it. And they've also lost a lot of faith in the UN. I think there's a lack of understanding of the political bodies of the UN versus other functions of the UN. Nonetheless, they have really lost their faith. And so I think there's a first time for everything. It's true that there is no procedure for suspension or removal in the founding document of the CSW, but I know that member states on ECOSOC are really looking into that. And I think it's a very needed intervention. And Afghanistan is on the CSW, but it's not the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban hasn't been accredited as representatives, as far as I know, and I don't believe Saudi Arabia is there anymore. So we're really looking at the Islamic Republic as quite an outlier on the CSW and in that leadership position. The only other thing I'd say is that there's a lot of people with power and connections who are in this audience or who are part of the ABA, and I would really encourage especially if you are in a country that is in the Latin America bloc or the Africa bloc or the Asia bloc, and those are members on the UN Human Rights Council who will be engaging on the idea of setting up an investigative mechanism. I would really encourage reaching out and supporting this. I know that there's a call for a standing mechanism, but even the folks who are calling for the standing mechanism have acknowledged it will take some time for that to be set up. There's a lot of political issues to work through, and they're very much in support of this. So happy to answer any questions on that. You can always find me somehow online, but we really need your support, and we need global support.
Thank you very much to the many entities inside and outside the ABA that have co-sponsored today's event, and special thanks to the ABA staff for their vital support. That includes Ira Shapiro, Christina Hyde, Angela Benson, and Lavinia Cousin, who has supported us today. We truly could not do it without the staff. And last but certainly not least, very, very special thanks to our distinguished panelists who have educated and inspired us vis-a-vis the ongoing events in Iran and the incredibly courageous people of Iran who are fighting for their freedom. So the bad thing about these virtual programs is that you can't hear our applause, but I hope that everyone out there in cyberspace is going to join me in applauding our really outstanding panel. Thank you very much. Women, Life, Liberty. Zan Zendegi Azadi. Thank you all. We stand adjourned.